title, The Fall of Ecowas, The Rise of the Sahel. In 1975, leaders from 15 West African nations gathered in Lagos, Nigeria, with a dream. They signed what became known as the Treaty of Lagos, officially creating the Economic Community of West African States, Ecowas. Their mission sounded noble: to build unity, open borders, promote trade, and protect peace across the region. Where are you watching from? Write your country in the comments, and please give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to see more stories about Africa from our lens. Thank you. After years of colonization, the dream was simple: to stand together as Africans and shape their own future. But over time, that dream began to lose its soul. In its early years, Ecowas appeared to offer hope. Meetings were held in luxurious conference halls, flags of independent nations fluttered side by side. Leaders spoke of progress and cooperation. Yet quietly, beneath all the speeches and photographs, the same invisible hand that once ruled Africa continued to pull the strings. The economies of many member states remained tied to Paris, London, and Washington. Their currencies were not truly their own. Their armies received training and equipment from abroad. Their policies echoed foreign advice. The cracks deepened as decades passed. When one country faced instability, Ecowas often looked to outside powers before making decisions. When another country's people cried for help, the responses came late or in the wrong direction. Instead of defending the sovereignty of its members, Ecowas slowly began to act as an enforcer for foreign interests, a system that punished African nations for standing up and rewarded them for obeying. By the early 2000s, Ecowas had turned into a political tool rather than a unifying force. Sanctions, interventions, and suspensions became its most visible weapons. The ordinary people in the streets of Bamako, Niamey, or Ouagadougou no longer saw Ecowas as their hope. They saw it as a gatekeeper that listened more to Europe than to Africa. And yet, life continued. Presidents came and went. New agreements were signed. Aid kept flowing, but true independence remained distant. Then, the 2020s arrived, and with them, a storm. Across West Africa, frustration boiled. In Mali, years of foreign military presence had failed to end the violence of terrorism. In Niger, uranium wealth enriched foreign nations while the people remained among the poorest on earth. In Burkina Faso, villages were being burnt by extremist attacks while promises of protection turned to dust. Everywhere, citizens were asking the same question: who truly governs us? In 2022, a young military officer in Burkina Faso named Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose to national attention. At just 34 years, he became one of the youngest leaders in the world. But his message was older than any border. He spoke of sovereignty, of self-respect, and of a return to African dignity. His speeches were not long, but they struck a deep chord. If we are truly independent, then let us act like it. That single sentence echoed across the Sahel. Mali, led by Colonel Assimi Goïta, had already chosen to walk a similar path, rejecting the influence of external powers. Niger followed soon after its own soldiers declared that their land would no longer bow to Paris. Together, these three nations, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, decided to shape their own destiny. And in early 2025, they made history. They announced their withdrawal from Ecowas. The news spread across Africa like wildfire. Commentators called it madness. Analysts predicted disaster. Western capitals expressed deep concern. But in the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, there was music, there was dancing, there was pride. For the first time in 50 years, three West African nations had looked at a system built in the name of unity and said, enough. Their withdrawal was not just a political act, it was a spiritual statement. They were rejecting dependency. They were saying that a union that listens to Paris before it listens to its own people is not a union worth belonging to. Out of that decision came something new, something no one had imagined just a few years earlier. They called it the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES. The AES was not designed by economists or consultants. It was not born from foreign aid or political pressure. It was born from shared pain and shared hope. Three nations who had suffered together, deciding to rise together. Its principles were simple: mutual defense, economic cooperation, and political independence. Its foundation was trust, not treaties written in foreign languages. The world watched, waiting for them to fail. But instead of chaos, something surprising happened. The alliance grew stronger with each challenge. Borders opened among the three. Soldiers trained side by side. Food, energy, and infrastructure plans began to take shape. Mali offered land routes. Niger shared energy potential. Burkina Faso contributed agricultural strength. Together, they started to build what Ecowas had promised but never delivered: real cooperation owned by Africans themselves. For Paris and Brussels, it was an earthquake. For Washington, it was confusion. For many Africans, it was a breath of fresh air. And at the center of it all stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a man who seemed to carry the weight of a continent on his young shoulders. Unlike many leaders before him, Traoré spoke not in the language of appeasement, but of purpose. He reminded the world that Africa's destiny could not be written in foreign capitals. He reminded his people that liberation was not an event, but a process. He once said, "If we keep waiting for others to come and save us, then we have not learned from history." His words were not just political, they were deeply philosophical. To many across Africa, he became a symbol of a new generation, disciplined, defiant, and determined. Under Traoré's guidance, Burkina Faso began to realign its economy, strengthen ties with its neighbors, and build local industries. Schools were encouraged to teach African history with pride. The military was restructured to serve communities rather than elites. And slowly, despite foreign media portraying doom, the country began to regain confidence. Meanwhile, in Mali and Niger, similar movements were taking place. The three countries realized that unity was not about obeying a distinct bloc, but about understanding shared struggles. Terrorism didn't end overnight, poverty didn't vanish, but for the first time in decades, their destiny was in their own hands. Ecowas, once seen as the pillar of regional unity, began to lose its moral authority. Its sanctions against the Sahel nations only deepened resentment. Many ordinary West Africans began to ask, if Ecowas punishes Africans for standing up, who is it really serving? That question spread like wildfire. Across Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria, public debates erupted. People started to compare the promises of Ecowas versus the courage of AES. Slowly, the old idea of West African unity began to be reimagined, not through bureaucracy, but through the shared heartbeat of a people rediscovering their identity. The shift was not without tension. Western powers feared the loss of influence in the Sahel, a region rich in gold, uranium, and other strategic resources. They warned of instability, but Africans knew that sometimes instability is just the birth pain of transformation. By late 2025, the Alliance of Sahel States had become a political and emotional force, not only a symbol of resistance, but a blueprint for what an African-led union could look like. Leaders from other regions began to visit Ouagadougou and Bamako. Youth across the continent started wearing shirts with the words "Sahel Rising." A new consciousness was being born. It wasn't about isolation, it was about self-determination. The Sahel nations were not rejecting the world, they were demanding to meet it as equals. Traoré often reminded his people, "We are not against cooperation, but cooperation must not mean submission." That philosophy began to redefine African politics. The AES started exploring a common currency, controlled and printed within Africa, not in Europe. They began discussions on shared security strategies, joint farming initiatives, and regional infrastructure. For the first time, independence was becoming practical, not just poetic. And while Ecowas struggled to explain its sanctions and shrinking influence, the AES carried on with quiet confidence. History had turned a page. The fall of Ecowas was not a sudden collapse, it was a gradual awakening. For half a century, the idea of unity was tied to dependency. The new generation, led by Traoré and his counterparts, had decided that real unity must come from within. In the villages and towns of the Sahel, elders spoke with renewed hope. They said they had not seen such determination since the early days of independence in the 1960s. For the first time in many years, the word Africa sounded proud again. Not as a victim, but as a participant in global destiny. Of course, challenges remain. Poverty is still real. External pressure continues. But something fundamental has changed. The mindset. The idea that Africans cannot decide for themselves is dying. And perhaps that was the true revolution all along. When historians look back on this period, they may call it the second African independence, not fought with guns, but with ideas, not declared in foreign parliaments, but in the hearts of ordinary people who chose dignity over fear. The fall of Ecowas, once seen as unthinkable, may one day be remembered as the moment when Africa's story took a new turn, from imitation to invention, from obedience to ownership. And at the center of it all, names like Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani will stand, not as perfect men, but as symbols of a generation that refused to bow. In the Sahel, the winds are shifting. The dust that once covered the ground is rising again, not as chaos, but as movement. From that dust, new nations are taking shape. From that silence, new voices are speaking. And from that unity, a new Africa is being born, bold, self-reliant, and unafraid to dream again. Because sometimes the end of one system is not destruction, it is the beginning of truth. And for West Africa, that truth has a new name: the Alliance of Sahel States.